Does anyone have any initial thoughts or reactions to the body ritual piece?
It took me probably a couple paragraphs or so to figure out what was going on. It was kind of reminded me of, I guess, just that the other piece that we read, where with the tidally locked planet, just
Week for day,
in,
yeah.
you're right, yeah, with just in terms of like the experience of like figuring out what was going on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then it took me longer to get the naming scheme that he was using.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was good. I thought it was interesting, like how he was. I couldn't quite tell if he was like satirizing like people's common conceptions or satirizing like the people in the field of anthropology, or
Why not both?
or just satirizing like American culture. Maybe all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I read this for the first time in a sociology class in high school. So I think I read this when I was in 11th grade. And for some reason, it always stuck with me in the back of my mind. And as an example of taking yourself outside of a culture and looking back at it in the most absurd lens possible. And I think that that's an extreme reaction. It's an extreme exercise, but I think being able to go to that extreme and look at a culture that you're from, that you have experience with, and be able to describe it in a way that totally isn't what's happening. Well, literally that's what's happening, but like it's very absurd. I think that's a really great exercise. Any other thoughts, just like gut responses to the piece?
I was fascinated by the way the author termed what we call science magic, because I think there's been such a push to do so many things scientifically, and the magical medicine man sort of thing, well, that's science, and science just feels so different from magic. So it was fascinating to me to see that flip. And I read something very similar in middle school, and it also always stuck with me.
That's great. We will come back to this in the history of science and technology lecture, but I just finished editing it, which is why it's so fresh in my mind, because I did a guest interview. Throughout time and space, people have had different frameworks of how the universe works. And right now, the modern framework tends to really emphasize the scientific method. But that's not necessarily how it has to be. And so you can imagine people who do things logically with an internally coherent logic system, like magic men, magic medicine men, magic medicine people. This piece is old. There are doctors who aren't men these days, but you can imagine a world where people do things very similar to how we do them, but they think of it as magic instead of science. So we can keep that in mind too, different frameworks that people might have for looking at and thinking about the world around them. Any other initial thoughts?
I think it's interesting that it so, easily makes us sound like, backwards lunatics when, your own society. And it's like, we're not like that. And it makes you think of all the ways you hear other societies described, especially, like First Nations or tribal people. And you're like, maybe we're terrible.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that bleeds really well into the cultural appropriation piece. that we can talk about. So it's a worthwhile exercise to think about cultures in the most extreme, absurd ways possible, but especially your own culture, so that you can try and divorce yourself from it as much as possible, which is really helpful if you're writing about other cultures or creating a totally new culture. But it does open up the possibility of treating that culture as a stereotype and making fun of it, which I think is a big part of cultural appropriation. So what would you say about the body ritual piece if it had been done by someone who wasn't an American, who wasn't embedded in this culture? Would it feel offensive? Would it feel like more of a joke? Would it feel totally fine?
I feel like that would depend on who's doing it. So if it was somebody from a culture that Americans tend to write about like this, then I'd feel like it's a fair satire. But if it was, I don't know, it's hard to imagine a culture who we are like, because, you know, Americans are, the Americans, the British, you know, we've done a lot of colonizing. But if there was like an instance where America was like the people being colonized and you know, whoever colonized them were speaking about Americans like this, then it might feel more offensive. But since there's a power structure here, it doesn't seem like such a big deal to me.
Got it. When you think about cultural appropriation, does power structure mean a lot to you? Like who in this situation has power versus who doesn't?
Yeah, I think that's a big driver in whether or not something feels appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do other people feel? If you think about your personal definition of cultural appropriation, what factors are really important to you? Is it power? Is it like experience with the culture you're representing? Is it the tone that you use, like whether you're super serious or mocking or whatever? So what do you feel?
Yeah, I think power structure to me is probably even the defining aspect, or like the main distinguishing aspect between cultural appreciation and appropriation. Like the way I think about it is the difference between you know, just copying somebody's work and saying it's like plagiarism versus being inspired by somebody. But then there is a difference in the power hierarchy, so that if you steal it and if you're more powerful, you can get away with it. And
okay. So does that mean that a person from a more traditionally powerful group should never talk about or create a piece that is about another culture that has traditionally less power? And power is like a coded word. It means a lot, but
yeah, no, not at all. I think it just means that if you're doing it, then first of all, be respectful to the culture, understand the history, and understand basically the entire context, and yeah, just do it with good intentions, and respect. But these are kind of vague ideas. So that's why I think cultural appropriation is something like you see it when you you know it when you see it.
yes.
But if I had to put it to words, I think this would be something like it. So first of all, I think respect is very important, and you can kind of tell when somebody is just sort of doing lip service versus somebody is like honestly is really inspired by a culture. It's easy to tell. I think.
Yeah. Anyone else focus on other characteristics? Philip, you looked like you had something to say earlier.
Oh yeah, and I mean I'm still thinking of stuff, but But I definitely agree that the power aspect of it is a major player. And for me, I think about it's kind of who's controlling the narrative. So if you are a member of that, sort of dominant group, however that's defined, which I mean, that can be pretty easily defined a lot of times. But if you are a member of that group and you're, putting this information out there, it's like, oh, have you done anything to make sure that your voice isn't becoming the authority on this thing that you don't really know that well? And yeah, I mean, I think also, so yeah, it's controlling the narrative and just what is the message that you're conveying. Some of that has to do with intention, and then some of it has to do with just thoughtfulness. Because so it made me think of a conversation that's a little different, but I had a conversation with somebody maybe a month or two ago about language around the pandemic, and they were asking like, oh, well, what's the problem with calling it the Chinese flu? Because like, the 1918 one, they called it the Spanish flu, and like that doesn't seem like it's a horrible thing. And I'm like, well, yeah, but like hearing that out of certain people's mouths, like what message you're trying to convey, the division that's sowing, and the way that is impacting people who are connected to that word Chinese. So yeah, I think just an awareness of reality really matters. And then yeah, power is a big part of that.
Yeah, so like Tassif said, respect and intent, and then Philip adding on awareness. Like you can have the best intentions, but if you don't do the work and the research, which is something they talked about in the cultural appropriation piece, if you don't do the research to really understand the culture you're trying to represent, then your intentions don't mean as much, or people can't see your intentions. Right? People can see your actions, they can't see what you want to do. Any other thoughts? James, Andy, Jess?
I read this really great article, which I will try to find and share. But I remember like a few years ago when it seemed like it was like cultural appropriation was becoming like a very hot topic. There's an article that I read that was like, I thought it was really good in really breaking down the components of like kind of why certain things end up seeming wrong and others don't. And I unfortunately I can't really remember what they were, aside from like power. Power was definitely part of it. But one of the things about power relationships that I think is important is that like it's not just like a one-dimensional gradient of power, that like people who like the contexts that you might be appropriating from are like maybe you aren't from a group that had power over, or maybe you are from a group that has like more power in the world than some other group, but you don't realize it because you don't have like your group didn't have specific power over that group or something, or maybe you don't realize that like this other group, like they seem completely detached from you, but they have their own history and their own in their own place with, and their relationships with other groups mean that like particular uses of their culture, you don't necessarily expect the effects that it would have. And it goes both ways. Like sometimes it's like something seems like it's okay, but you don't really know why it seems okay when it kind of ticks all the other not okay boxes. And like sometimes, I don't know, there's basically, I'm not explaining this very well, but I'll try to find that article.
Yeah, I would definitely love to see that article. And the point about power exists along multiple axes is a really great one. Most of the time when people talk about cultural appropriation, they usually mean from different ethnic or racial cultures. But there are subcultures that can be defined according to affinities, things like gamer culture or biker culture. You can also have cultures that are defined by gender identity or sexual orientation or age. I would have a very hard time writing a piece about a much older person because I'm not embedded in that culture. I don't have those experiences. That doesn't mean I can't do it. I could do the work and the research to figure out what living as a member of that culture is like, but it would take work. So my hope for this conversation is not to get you to think that you can't write or can't draw inspiration from other cultures, but to get you thinking about maybe how will other people interpret your stories and your actions, how will other people respond to them, what work might go into creating a more culturally sensitive and respectful story, especially if you're drawing from cultures that you might not be as familiar with. Because it's really tempting to what the article called cherry pick, to cherry pick from other cultures, because some stuff is really cool. But if you aren't doing the research to figure out, why is that really cool piece of culture there? What other parts of culture does it connect to? Where does it come from? Then you're not doing that culture as much of a service as you might want to if your intentions are good. And I like to assume that all of our intentions are good. Any questions or thoughts? Any more factors that you think go into cultural appropriation?
I think like one of the things that I think about a lot is like when you're creating new imaginary cultures, and those cultures are in some way they're going to be a synthesis of everything that you know. It's like it somehow seems difficult to avoid the cherry picking in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see how like the remedy to that can be, like you were saying, just going deeper and deeper on the context, and like if you create a culture that's like a patchwork of different things that
Mm-hmm.
don't really fit together well because like you think they're all cool things from different cultures, but like they have conflicting reasons for existing, then that's not going to ring true, especially to people from those cultures.
Yeah. If you're just cherry picking the coolest stuff without really thinking about why it exists, then you might end up with worst world building where things don't fit together. So I like to think of it when I draw inspiration from other cultures for my stories. Instead of cherry picking, I like to think of it as there's a gardening term like repotting. So instead of just picking the cherry from the stem, take the whole plant. It's like go deeper than the cherry, look at the stem, look at the roots, look at the type of soil that that plant really thrives in. And then you can repot that plant or I don't garden. You can take that whole plant and put it in a new soil patch where it can thrive. And if you're putting other plants in that same patch that all work in the same type of soil, then it's going to make a lot more sense. And it's going to feel deeper and richer, and the parts of the cultures that you've chosen, they won't conflict with each other because they work in the same soil. But you can only know that if you've done the research to figure out, what type of soil, what type of environment does this culture come from and thrive in.
I like the analogy a lot.
Thanks. All right, any last thoughts before we move on to the lecture? we can always come back to this too. If people have thoughts later, feel free to flag me in the lecture and say, I have thought. All right.
A thought now, sorry.
Yay.
I was noticing the talk to people piece and how deeply, incredibly important that is. And I'm thinking about what that might or might not look like. Like, of course, depending on the culture, there are so many things to read, so many ways to research, but how do you know who to talk to without asking someone to do work that isn't actually theirs to do? Like, what does communication look like is something that I've been wondering about.
That's a really great question. Other people feel free to weigh in, but what I got from that article was that there are online resources you can look, or lists online of people who are saying they'll work as sensitivity readers. That takes money because you should pay them for their time if you're able, but so you can go there. I've worked as a sensitivity reader for my friends, people who have written stories or plays, and they want my input as a world builder, but also as, you know, a person with my identities. So you can ask your friends, you can go to those lists. There's this cultural movement right now that, you know, people of color, people from traditionally marginalized identities, they don't owe anyone any education. And I really strongly believe that. But I, at the same time, think that there are people who have marginalized identities who know they don't owe anyone anything, but they still want to educate people. Not everyone is like that. But if you have friends who don't mind educating, if you reach out to people and you can ask respectfully, I think people will see that, and so you can ask them in that way. Does anyone else have other ideas, sources, recommendations?
I was just wondering, if the people who are marginalized don't tell their stories, then who will? I mean, I understand that you're not everybody is supposed to tell their story, but I think saying that they don't owe the story, I feel like it's because there are too many people out there who do the opposite, like who don't tell your story or just marginalize it. So I would have thought that speaking up or just making sure that your story is out there is important.
Yeah, and your piece can also be seen, if you do it this way, it can be seen as helping someone tell their story. So people collaborate on stories all the time. They tell stories together, and so if you're open to it, the piece doesn't have to be yours alone with sensitivity readers that you've hired. It can be a collaboration between people with different identities.
Right.
Yeah, I think it also ties to that cherry picking versus repotting analogy, which I also really like. I never heard that before. So I think that a lot of times when it comes to like getting to know somebody's story or whatever, the individual person's story is the fruit, like that's the cherry. But there's like so much information that's out there, especially now we're in a really connected world, and you know the internet. There's just like so much stuff available. So it's like if you spend the time to like read some books and watch some documentaries and stuff, you can get a lot of stuff that allows the individual who you genuinely want to connect with, it makes them not have to do as much legwork. So it may make that less of a I just kind of want to like hear about you to learn, and more of a genuine connection because you've already learned a lot and you're just genuinely curious about this person.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Does that answer your question, Jess?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so let's move on to some definitions. Culture is a super broad term. It's a really big umbrella. It's a tent, really. It's more of a tent than an umbrella, but it encompasses all of the customs, arts, social institutions, achievements, folklore, which we'll talk about. So basically all of the behaviors, all of the norms, all of the shared thoughts and experiences of a particular group. You can have subcultures, you can have countercultures. We'll get to that in a little bit, but culture is very broad. And because I've always had trouble when I'm world building thinking of the different things that I should really try and flesh out here, and I've shown these before, these are my favorite images to get a sense for what the different aspects or the different like topics of culture can be. So things like sense of humor, work ethic, work schedules, the fact that in the US, a 5-day work week with a 9-to-5 schedule is much more common than some places in Europe where it's more customary to have an hour or two long break in the afternoon, and people might take like a month of vacation off during the summer. These are cultural differences. They have reasons. There are reasons that these things exist. It's not totally random, but you can think about that when you're building your world. What are people really proud of? What do people consider beautiful? What do people's families look like? And I think, was it Jess who was talking about housing earlier? Yeah, what do people's families look like? Who do you live with? There are some cultures and there are some people who prefer found family, you know, friends and others who you have encountered throughout your life, and they become very important to you as opposed to blood relatives. Some people only consider their immediate family, like their mom, dad, mom, whatever, like their parents and siblings, their family. Other people go a lot wider with it, and they talk about cousins and aunts and grandparents and things like that. So, you know, what do families look like? What do they value? What types of art do they consume? All of that is a part of culture, which is a lot. And that's why this part of world building can seem so intimidating, I think, when you're first getting started with world building. My biggest piece of advice that I can offer is to write everything down. I have a note on my phone that I keep for whenever I'm writing a story for different world building ideas that I have, because they don't come when I'm sitting at my desk trying to write. They come when I'm out in the world and I see something and I'm inspired, or if I'm reading a book or watching a video or a documentary about the history of textiles, which is why I got so excited about it earlier, because that's something I'm watching right now. But I write everything down, and not everything gets used. A lot of it gets deleted. A lot of it never makes it into the story, because world building is an iceberg. Only 10% of about, you know, very little of the world building work you do is going to make it into your story, but you have to have the whole thing figured out for people to walk on the top of the iceberg, for it to feel like a real world that's been fully fleshed out and imagined. Culture, let me look at the time. Let's actually take the break now. So let's take 5 minutes, be back at 2:02-ish, and then we'll talk about how culture forms, because I don't want to interrupt this part of the lecture. So I will see you in 5.
Tragically, I just got another meeting notice, so I'm gonna miss the second half of this most likely. But I might. It's like a COVID update from work. I don't think we're actually gonna get updated on anything. So like, if like, I mean, because I've already been told like nothing's gonna change. Like we're still gonna be working. So if I can come back, I will, but I might not. So
okay, and I'll send out the lecture again like last week. So
yeah, this seems like it'll be a great lecture, but
it's okay. It's mostly discussion, but we can do that later.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Bye, Philip.
Bye.
I have a question
Yeah.
about cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
So this came up as I was discussing this topic with somebody, and um, something came up about like at what age um, do you have to kind of think about cultural appropriation? So, for example, can kids be blamed of cultural appropriation? Because kids are easy and they get easily fascinated by
Mm-hmm.
some aspect of some culture and they want to copy it, but they're also not at an age where you can expect them to do the research and everything.
Right.
On the other hand, you know that their intentions are good. They're just really fascinated by something and they just want to copy it. So I was wondering, like, at what age does it become kind of important for you to know that there is this distinction?
That's a really
And
great question.
people's thoughts on it.
Yeah. I mean, that gets into at what age are people personally responsible for their actions? And I think it varies.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, the first example of a kid doing something that might be considered culturally appropriative is Halloween costumes. But how often do kids actually like come up with and execute different Halloween costume ideas?
Mhm.
Usually there's some adult involvement if it's like a young kid. I'm thinking like 5 years old.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it really depends on how.
It being, I guess she was being accused of. I don't know the entire story. This was the source of that discussion that I had with my friend. And she's being accused of appropriating culture, and then there was this big discussion of people who were like, no, but now we can't even wear dresses. Like, what's wrong with that, etc., etc. And then so I was just wondering that, like, I think if you overdo it, then there's this danger that people don't want to learn and explore another culture, which is the opposite of it. Which is exactly the opposite of what you want. You want to get to a stage where you don't even have to tell people that there is a distinction between appropriation and appreciation. Everything is appreciation. Which can only come if people take their time and get into at least knowing one culture outside of theirs.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I like the way you put it, that you want to get to the point where people are learning about things, and like if you get to a point where there's no cultural appropriation, that means that people aren't thinking about the difference between appreciation and appropriation.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. That's a really great question to explore.
Yeah.
I think, oh, right. Philip had a meeting. So I think everyone's here. Is everyone ready to get started? Okay, great. So cultures form in a lot of different ways. And a lot of it, the reason I structure facts-based world building the way that I do is because culture depends directly on biology and environment, and a lot of randomness too, because there's randomness involved in biology. We talked about that last week. And there's randomness involved in environment too. I mean, we can't predict when earthquakes are going to happen or when big tsunamis are going to happen. So there's a lot of randomness, and that's what creates culture. But what your life forms do, like the actual behaviors that they have, the activities that they do, even the rituals that they create, depend on what the life forms need. So, for example, do they need to eat or drink? This isn't a given. Humans need to eat or drink, and we need to drink more. We need to drink more water than we need to eat. So that is tied up in how our biology works. But not every life form is going to need to eat or drink in the way we do. Do they need to sleep? Apparently, bullfrogs don't sleep. And there's an entire field of biology that's devoted to figuring out like which animals sleep and how much they need to sleep and why, and they have to do their experiments in weird and interesting ways. So the way this is just me nerding out. The way they did it with bullfrogs was waiting until the bullfrog appeared to be in a very restful state, and then doing something surprising, maybe like making a loud noise, and the response that the bullfrog had was the same when they were in that restful state versus when they weren't. So the scientists concluded that bullfrogs don't sleep in the same way humans do, because if something happens when you're asleep, even if you wake up immediately, your response is very different if you're asleep versus when, you know, the thing happened when you're awake. So do your life forms need to sleep? Do they need to reproduce? What do they need to make that happen? We talked last week about how some different species will reproduce asexually. Even if you do use sexual reproduction, you can fertilize eggs internally or externally. You can imagine worlds where different gametes exist, so maybe there aren't like eggs and sperm, but you can make up new ones. So think about what your life forms actually need to survive. You can think of this in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So food and water, and then shelter, and then working your way up to social interactions, which is something that as humans we need to function healthily. Is that a word? I don't know. Jess is nodding, so yeah, that's a word, thank you. And then working your way up to self-actualization. So think about what this hierarchy of needs looks like for the life forms on your world. If your life forms are humans, and then that's great. You can just use the hierarchy of needs that we have. How they do those behaviors, those rituals or whatever, that depends on the resources that they have available to them. So for example, you see different cultures, different regions around the world having their own cuisine. And that's not because there are different types of people around the world. It's because they have access to different resources. So even though we all need the same things, we all need to eat and drink and sleep, and we all need shelter, the resources that we have will determine what that food, what those sleeping arrangements, what our shelters look like. So if you have access to different kinds of spices and plants and animals, you'll get different cuisines. If you have access to different types of rock and wood and other material, then you will have different architecture. Also, if you have different weather patterns, you'll have different architecture. So thinking about what the resources that are available are to your life forms, that's going to determine how they do it. So the first one you can see is biology, and the second one is environment, and that's why culture depends on both of them. Now, the manner in which your life forms do those rituals, if the rituals seem mean and ruthless, or if they seem really generous, or if they seem really intellectual, or whatever, the manner that your life forms do these rituals in depends on what they value. And I think that when you're talking about culture, culture influences a lot of stuff, but what really influences culture is values. And you can I would recommend spending a long time thinking about what your life forms value. It can be material values, like what do they actually enjoy? Enjoy looking at and touching and being around. That goes into things like ideals of beauty. But it can also be personality traits that they value, like honesty or humor, or maybe literal interpretations. So spend a long time thinking about what they value. And because that can seem like a really thing to just start thinking about, I found this really cool, I guess it's behavioral psychology concept called moral foundations theory. And it says that a society's values, their cultures, their norms, they're based on this kind of implicit moral code. So if you're born into a culture, if you're raised in, if you're steeped in a culture, no one probably no one had to tell you that killing is bad. Probably no one had to tell you, depending on where you grew up, that bodily autonomy is something we value, right? All of these things are implicit. You learn them as you grow up based on observing other people's behaviors. So you don't have to be explicitly told these values, but everyone knows that they're there, and everyone is expected to follow them. And if you don't follow them, then that's breaking the law most of the time. Not all laws, especially in our legal system, map directly onto values, but that's because of how our legal system was formed. Also, if you go to different cultures that have different values, you might find a very different legal system. If you create your own world with different cultures, you can create your own legal system, and that's why we have a lecture about political science later on. But think about what the values are. That implicit moral code can be mapped onto a bunch of different axes. Moral foundations theory originally identified 5 different axes for this moral code, and since then people have added on. So I think I list 9, but there are others that people have proposed and others that people have abandoned. This link up at the top, the moral foundations theory, links to a page that goes into a lot more detail about the different axes, but I think it only focuses on the first 6. So these axes, they get at the different things that a society might care about. So the first one, care versus harm. Does your society, will it prioritize avoiding harm at all costs, or will it be somewhere in the middle of trying to take care of people versus trying to harm them? That's why these are axes. They're spectra, right? You can exist anywhere along these axes. And if you can map your society, if you can map your culture along these different axes, then that will go a long way in helping you decide how your culture, how members from your society will behave later on when they're faced with different issues and obstacles. I think that this is the type of thing that really just, like, you have to look for examples of this. And this is why a lot of fiction writers or people creating fictional worlds will draw from specific examples of different cultures, because just like creating one of these maps off the top of your head is pretty difficult, because there are so many different axes and there are so many different possible combinations. And because, and I closed all of the pictures so that people can see the entire screen. And now I'm going to bring you back. Any questions or thoughts about moral foundations theory? Okay, cool. Someone unmuted.
I was just gonna say, like, I guess, does moral foundations theory have anything to say about like why one set of virtues would exist in a particular environment, like, or is it kind of like after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes after. So figuring out why a specific culture might map in a given way, that's based on environment and biology. So if you have if you have a group of people who need to consume a lot of resources, for example, like maybe they have really fast metabolisms and they have to eat a lot of food to maintain whatever, but they also live in a resource poor environment, that's going to create a very different type of society than one where resources are plentiful and maybe they don't have to consume as much resources anyway, as many resources. So the first example, the society that needs a lot of stuff but doesn't have a lot of stuff. I can imagine that being more of a competitive society where maybe, and you can see it going in different ways too, like it might be a competitive society where it's every person for themselves, or it might be a competitive society where it's like every family for themselves, but within families, however they're defined, people will really work to take care of the group. So you can see it going different ways, and that's where the randomness comes in. You can really choose, which is helpful because you can choose something that is convenient for your story, as long as it has roots in the environment and the biology. As long as you have justification for it, then it's going to make sense. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Andy, you look like you might have something to say. No? Okay. Okay, cool. Culture isn't static, it changes over time. And there's no one thing that will change culture, and there's no one way that culture has to change or one direction that it has to move in. So this is, again, another place where it's it can be a lot of imagination, a lot of randomness going into the decisions you make. But cultures can change because they adapted to availability of resources. Think right now where we're having a renewable energy movement and a climate crisis movement, because we're seeing how fossil fuels, energy from fossil fuels, are affecting our environment. And we're also seeing that this resource is limited. So we're trying to adapt, hopefully. We're trying to adapt to different energy sources. And that comes along with cultural changes. I just bought this new type of toothpaste that isn't even paste. Like, it comes in these tiny little tablets because I wanted to reduce plastic waste. And that's like a very small example, but something that you can exaggerate that, you can blow it up to talk about how people might change their behaviors to adapt to resource availability. Cultures can also change because people innovate. They invent new forms of technology or new ways of doing things. So the advent of farming created this huge cultural shift very early on in human evolution, where instead of migrating and instead of being a more hunter-gatherer society, we created more sedentary settlements. So we moved from being nomadic to having cities and villages and then cities, but not everyone did that, right? So if you're talking about cultures changing over time, remember that not everyone will conform to that change. There are still nomadic societies and cultures, and they are every bit as valid as the sedentary cultures that have become more common. Cultures also change because different behaviors and rituals get merged together through immigration. And through immigration is my kind of catch-all for interactions between different cultures. So people migrating from one place to another and bringing their beliefs is the most obvious example. Neil Gaiman's American Gods is an entire book that then got turned into a TV show about people bringing their beliefs, which I think is really beautifully illustrated as people bringing their literal gods, like these characters, over to the US when they migrated here. And all of those gods, all of those beliefs are merging together. We call the US a melting pot for a reason. It's because cultures get mixed up and combined here. But it doesn't have to be through mass migration. You can also imagine just one individual family moving to another place and maybe, marrying people who live in that place. When you marry someone, hopefully what happens is you compromise, right? Like, you combine your cultures. My partner is Jewish, and so we've talked about how we will celebrate different holidays together, how we're going to bring in different things like food and religious education if we one day decide to have children. So just interactions between people from different cultures will, over time, create cultural change. And this is very similar to evolution, too. We talked last week about how one person introducing their genes to a population's pool of genetics will be, like on a very small scale, a type of evolution. And the same thing happens with culture. Cultures can also change because they got dominated and wiped out through conquest, which is unfortunate, but we've seen it a lot throughout history. You can try to create a world where this doesn't happen, a utopia maybe where people either choose not to dominate other people. I did an episode of my podcast where I wanted to imagine a world without colonialism and like imperialism. And I imagined that if the world was bigger and if the land masses were further apart, so it was harder to move from one landmass to another, that you might not have as much conquest and you might not have much domination from one culture over another. So you can imagine worlds where this isn't the case, but it is the case on our world, and it probably is very common if the characteristics of a world allow for it. But one really cool thing that you see looking at different cultures that have been oppressed and conquered is that the oppressed society, as a consequence of being conquered, they often hold on tighter to their cultural values and their shared cultural identity. For example, nope, I don't have an example. Do I? The Eddas, the prose, no, those were written by Christians who like went in. But they're different cultural stories, especially, or rituals that people can use to remind themselves of who they used to be before someone came in and said, you can't speak your language anymore, you can't tell your stories, you can't practice your religion, you can't celebrate your holidays. When people are told that, it usually just makes them want to do it more. So they'll hold on to anything that they can use to, remember who they were and keep their cultural ties strong. Culture depends on history. So if you used to be invaded a lot, then you might develop more of a warrior culture to protect yourselves from invasion. If you are a culture that has had a lot of natural disasters happen. If you live near the coast, for example, and you experience a lot of tidal waves, then maybe you'll adapt your culture to more literally elevated societies, like houses on stilts, for example. And so that's a way of changing culture based on your history. And whatever cultures decide, like in the moment, will influence the future, because culture is this cycle that depends on what came before. So cultures change over time, and the way they change will depend on how they've changed in the past, which is annoying. But it means that when you're doing your world building, you have to think about the history of a place. You can't just start in the present moment of your story and world build from there. You have to think about what came before. And just a few things to keep in mind. This is basically just what I thought of while I was making this presentation, but that doesn't mean there aren't other things that are important to remember about culture. So remember, no culture is a monolith. There will be subcultures. I mentioned biker culture and gamer culture. Those are subcultures of, well, I mean, it's not like gamers only exist in the US, right? But there are subcultures within a culture, and oftentimes those will bleed over and interact with other cultures, which is pretty cool. There are also countercultures, groups of people who define themselves by not conforming to the bigger culture that they're embedded in. Like the whole punk movement was in itself a counterculture, trying to fight against the bigger culture that they lived in. isolated regions like islands or even landlocked places that are surrounded by mountains and other hard to navigate terrains, they have less influence from other outside cultures. And so you might find that they have more of a well-defined culture, a culture that might be really different from an outsider's perspective, because there was no melting pot for these very isolated regions. This is slightly different from counterculture, but some cultures will define themselves in opposition to a nearby culture, especially if in the past they conflicted with each other. N.K. Jemisin talked about this a little bit in the podcast with Ezra Klein that I had you listen to before the very first lecture. These groups of people who just don't like another group of people because of some conflict that they've had in the past. And that conflict can be really big, or it can be really small, or it can be a really small thing that's been blown out of proportion to become really big. And so groups will set up a culture that just makes them seem really different from a group of people they don't like. This is a really random thing to include here, but I guess when I was making this presentation, I really wanted you to be careful of turns of phrase that are culturally specific. Maybe, was it James who brought up language last time? Or sometime in the past?
Maybe.
I think someone brought up language in a previous lecture, and it reminded me that, you know, if you're writing your stories in English, then your characters, if you're writing a story at all, and if you're writing it in English, then your characters will be speaking English. But if you're writing a story that's set on a totally different world, in reality, for your characters, they won't actually be speaking English because that just wouldn't make sense. But you have to write in a language that your readers can understand. So when you're doing that, if you're writing in English, be careful not to use phrases that are specific to our culture. Things like dialing the phone, or rolling down the window, or other things that I can't think of right now. Those are based on things that happened specifically in our past, like the ways that technology were used. And I'm sure there are examples from other cultures of phrases that are, you know, based on pop culture references, or are based on historical figures that people from that place will be more familiar with. So just be really careful of idioms and euphemisms that don't make sense in a new cultural context. And you can draw inspiration from the real world. You should draw inspiration from the real world, especially if you want to build a world and tell a story to get people interested in, or to get them to know about another culture that doesn't get represented enough. So definitely draw inspiration from the real world, but do your research, be respectful, maybe use sensitivity readers, so follow the steps that they outlined, or take some of the advice that they gave in the cultural appropriation piece. And now let's talk about how we'll use this in the worlds that you're building. So this link will send you to, actually, I think I can click on it. So this link goes to Well Storied, which has a podcast, so you can listen to this podcast episode, but it also, can you see my screen still? Okay, great. But it also goes into different aspects of culture that you might want to focus on. So social norms, leadership and social classes, who has power, and how's the hierarchy structured, if there is one, although...
I only see a white screen right now.
Oh, that's not good. Well, the link will take you back to this page that goes into different aspects of culture you might want to think about. If you are if you're like staring at a blank page and you're like, oh, what part of culture should I focus on first? Then that link might help you, that podcast episode. But it's also an article, so you can read or listen, depending on your preference. So for your world, think about how often people from different cultures will interact with each other. Do any of you have enough knowledge about your world right now to know, like, do you know this about your world yet?
It's something that I've been trying to figure out. So like, uh, in my world, the kind of viewpoint character is from a culture that's more kind of nomadic hunter-gatherer, and I have kind of a vague sense that there would be more kind of more, let's say, it's like centralized, you know, maybe more urban kind of cultures that are not necessarily urban, but like that they would be like kind of more into farming and having like something like cities maybe. But I don't know. I don't have a clear idea of what that culture's like, so and I don't know how much the two would be interacting.
That's cool. Is this still the world where people kind of live in the asteroid belt and they mine stuff from the asteroids? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so think about how often different people from different cultures will interact. Also think about what happens when they interact. Is it aggressive? Is it collaborative? Is it totally indifferent? Like, do they ignore each other? Which doesn't happen often on our world, but I think it would be cool to see an instance of that. Think about how culture can be used to drive the plot of your story. So does anyone have an example of something they've read or seen or played recently, maybe, where culture, different rituals and beliefs that people had was used to drive plot?
I watched Black Panther recently, and it's awesome. The world building is great. I love that. And there's a lot of tension when an American ends up in Wakanda. I'm going to try to not spoil things for anyone who hasn't seen it, but there's a lot of tension between those two and another American character who jumps in. They're like, okay, how much do we want to open Wakanda's borders and overlap with the rest of the world, and what secrets should be shared and what secrets should be kept?
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that they did a really good job of showing that they had done the world building to think about what the cultural values were in Wakanda, but not hitting us over the head with it. So there was never a moment where characters sat down and they're like, we've been here for X number of years and we value this, and therefore we're not going to do this other behavior that wouldn't align with our values. No, it was much more, it was well integrated into the plot. And based on their behaviors, based on what happened in the movie, you could see what people believed and how they've behaved for a long time. And also see how big a deal it would be to make this cultural shift. So yeah, that's a really great example. Thank you. Any other examples?
I was actually going to piggyback off the Black Panther thing. An interview came out recently with Chadwick Boseman after he passed away that they wanted him to speak with an American or a British accent because they didn't think anyone would be able to understand him if he spoke with, an African dialect. To which he said, the whole point of the country is that it's never been colonized. Why would I have this accent? And he fought for it and eventually got to speak the way he wanted to.
That's amazing. Can you share a link to that interview if you have it handy?
I'll try to find it.
Okay. No worries if not. I can look for it after class and send it in an email. How does culture on your world evolve over time? And I think this gets back to a point that Jess made earlier about observation time. What is the time scale of your story? Will the story be about a cultural shift? Will the audience be able to see that unfold over the course of the story, or will it be hinted at? So do any of you have thoughts on that? What the scope of your story might be, or how much of your world you want to include in the story?
I started thinking about this, and I realized that actually I feel that different aspects of culture, like the axes that you showed, not in the moral, like all the different aspects of culture,
Mm-hmm.
they change at different time scales.
Yeah.
Very different. So, for example, something like language or dialect or slangs um, can change at very fast time scales, whereas fashion slightly slower, food even less, cultural. I think the moral aspect of the culture even slower, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just involved in those thoughts, and I was wondering like how long the like what aspects should come in, what aspects. I mean, basically in the time scale of the story, I think the things that are slow changing should just be constant, whereas things like dialect, etc., which are faster, can be made to be more. Um, you can show them changing essentially in the story.
Yeah, I love that point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, that these things will change on different timescales. I really love that. I think a person who does that really well is Tamora Pierce, who wrote lots of different series, but many of them were set in the same universe over many generations. And so you can see how some parts of culture stayed the same. Like there are some cities that are in multiple series because the cities are constant. They grow and they change over time, but the cities are still in the same place and they're called the same thing. But like the types of foods that people eat, the types of gods that they believe in, you can see those changing on different scales. So I think she does that really well. Has anyone else seen that happen really well?
Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn trilogies are a really cool example of this. His first trilogy, it's a traditional fantasy world, magic, yada yada yada, and then he's got a second trilogy that takes place in the same world 400 years later. And so many of the characters have become, religious or mythical figures. People talk about them, and every once in a while you hear things and you're like, that's not how it happened. But, they don't have, things change over so much time. Technology has changed. The way the magic works has changed. A big thing in the original series was that the evil overlord of the world had very strict rule over how people could breed, because it came out that he didn't want certain magics going to certain people. And with him gone, and those programs gone and people free to choose, the way magic interacted changed over the generations.
Yeah. Anyone else? Other examples?
I'm reminded of Charles Stross's novel Accelerando, which it's like it starts out as kind of a near future science fiction, a little bit cyberpunky, I guess, and then but the novel is structured as a bunch of short stories that kind of follow some kick-stand characters and their family members over like, I forget, like centuries or maybe millennia or something like that. And so culture and technology and everything else changes drastically, but you can kind of see how one stage kind of flows into the next. So I thought he did that really well.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when you're thinking about this, if you have an idea for a series, something that can encompass multiple or a larger time scale, then I think this is something that is really important for you to consider, how the culture changes over time. If you're thinking about a story that's more self-contained, that doesn't mean you can't talk about multiple generations within one story. I think that there are some really talented people who can do that very well. But that does take a lot of skill, and it does make more work for you and your reader. There are some people who think about what like your intention with the story is. Do you want it to be like a very simple, enjoyable, casual read? Or do you want it to be something that makes people think and makes people do a lot of work and makes people remember things, which is super valuable. But just like know what your intentions are, because that will determine how complicated you can make the story, how big your time and size scales can be for the story and your world.
I think just one way of doing that also is just to have like characters have a sense of their own history, their own culture's history, and like you don't need to really like be telling stories directly on large time scales to give the reader a sense that those time scales are present.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there are other things that you can do too. Like when you're world building, if you just get like super into the geological history of your world, maybe you can make your character an archaeologist. Like one of the characters in your story, make them an archaeologist, and then they can talk about the long history of the world, but it doesn't feel weird or jarring because that's what they do. That's what they love. Of course, they're going to talk about it. So you can think of little tricks like that. And I think that that's something that's really great, actually. If you just love exploring something, if you get a lot of play out of building out a particular aspect of your world, feel free, go do that, and then find a fun, surprising way to include it in your story, because I think that will bring your personality through too. If you have more fun developing something, then it'll be more fun for people to learn about it. So do that. Sorry about the sirens. I would love to hear some updates about some of your worlds, if possible. Here's what we're covering next week. Next week is going to be the folklore and religion lecture, which I'm very excited about. So this is what I want you to do for next week. Add some cultural values to the people in your world and choose a few aspects of culture. Maybe it's the one that you looked at from an alien's perspective at the very beginning of class, but choose a few different aspects of culture and then flesh them out and add them to your story. If you already have a story in mind to inhabit your world, then you can choose aspects of culture that seem particularly relevant to what will happen in your story.